Hello and welcome to Verbal to Visual. My name is Doug Neill, and today I'm going to be sharing how I created these sketch notes of Bon Iver's interview with Zane Lowe about the new album I. So this video isn't going to be so much about the ideas that I captured, but more the process by which I captured them. I encourage you to go check out the interview with Justin Vernon if you want to hear more about what the content of these visuals actually is. In this video, though, I wanted to talk about digital sketchnoting because that's a world that I'm starting to explore in a little bit more depth. For the most part, I lean more towards pen and paper sketchnoting, but I do appreciate this tool combination in particular, the iPad Pro and Apple Pencil, and I've already been using this tool quite a bit for some featured images, as well as some visual templates and sketchnote summaries that I've been creating for patrons of my podcast, The Doug Neill Show, but I haven't done a lot of real-time sketchnoting with this tool, and that's what I want to fix. I want to start experimenting more because there are enough benefits, enough features to this particular tool that are worth exploring. And that's my hope here as I do some experimenting to get to know the strengths and the weaknesses of digital sketchnoting to be able to share them with you. And in this case, it actually took a couple of attempts to complete a sketch note. The first thing that I tried sketchnoting was a totally different interview. That one was with Gia Tolentino about her new book, a collection of essays called Trick Mirror. For that one, I did a little bit of prep work. I added some light dot paper as background on one of the layers within the app that I'm using here, Procreate, with the idea of using that to help me keep things straight and keep letter size the same, but then turning off that layer once I actually save the sketch notes. I also created a custom color palette based on the book cover and did a bit of experimentation with brush size until I found a single one that I decided to stick with. In this case, that 30% size. And I did a little bit of sketchnoting as I listened to that interview, but it felt clunky from the start. I was kind of still just getting my bearings with how I wanted to use this tool for live sketchnoting, and I realized that I needed a bit more structure. That in this case, it wasn't helpful for me to have the full page to work with. So in order to create a bit more structure for myself, I created a real simple template. I added some rectangles to the page to break down where I wanted chunks of ideas to go. I gave a long horizontal section at the top for a title, then these equal-sized boxes, each of which would contain one mini sketch note, and then a little bit of space at the bottom just for a signature. And even though I could have used that structure to go back and keep listening to that interview with Gia Tolentino, I decided to pick a different one entirely for a couple of reasons. One, I was kind of frustrated enough with that first failed experience that I felt like I needed a fresh start. And also because I'd already gotten excited enough about reading that book, reading Tolentino's essays, that I didn't really want to come across any other spoilers, and that I would rather just read all of those essays first and then maybe go back and listen to those interviews to learn more about the writing process, which is something that I'm very interested in. So I decided to save those for later and kind of swap from the writing process to the music making process. That's where this interview between Justin Vernon of Bon Iver and Zane Lowe come in. And now, in addition to having that template to work with, I also started with some warming up, writing out the alphabet to get me ready, and then kind of just jumped in, knowing that I wanted to use each box there for a single story, a single mini sketch note. And as I was capturing those, I used layers a lot. Pretty much each line of text and each individual drawing got its own layer so that I could reposition them later as necessary. Eventually, later on in the process, I did end up merging some of those layers to be able to move groups of ideas around, but it was helpful to at first keep them separate, mainly because I'm kind of a stickler for centered text and centered images, and that ability to move each individual layer just kind of facilitates that particular preference of mine. I did find that the dot grid came in very very handy, both for drawing straight lines and keeping the text height consistent, and even making sure that the writing of my text from left to right didn't drift up or down. It's pretty easy for all of those things to happen when you're working on completely blank paper. In a few cases here, I did just get the text down without a visual and then moved on to the next box, knowing that I could always go back and add a visual later, or maybe I would want to merge that idea into a future box, or maybe even get rid of it entirely. I had these 6 boxes here as a starting point, but I knew that if more ideas than that came up that I wanted to capture, I could essentially just create a second page. As it turns out, I did just stick with the one page, and even in that case, it was helpful to have each of those blocks be the same size, because I did end up moving some of them kind of back one compared to their original position where I first drew them. And I did a lot of that final arranging of each of these chunks and some of the details within them. I did all of that after listening to the interview, which is kind of nice because you can take your time knowing that the ideas themselves are already down, and you can just do a little bit of that fine tuning. The same goes for the title and also the signature, and I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. My goal with interviews like these isn't to try to capture the conversation in any sort of a comprehensive sense, but just instead pick out a handful of stories that stood out to me and capture those stories with some combination of words and visuals so that I can remember just that singular story, but also very likely that one story will remind me of some of the other details from the conversation that I didn't necessarily capture, but I'm still likely to remember when I look back at this in the future. And for me in particular, as someone who's pretty new to real-time sketchnoting on the iPad, it was helpful to include this level of constraint, to have these equal-sized chunks already set out for me on the page, focus on one visual per chunk with a little bit of text woven in, and separating each of those pieces at first on their own layers, and then kind of merging it all together in the end. And based on my experience here, I would use this specific approach again, but I'm also excited to experiment with some new processes. Specifically, I'd like to try out more of a mind map or flowchart approach with digital sketchnoting. I enjoy that a lot with pen and paper, so it'd be fun to see how that goes on the iPad. I'd also like to try out some two-stage sketchnoting, where I first take some bullet point notes while listening to the interview or reading the book or watching the video, do those bullet points with brief text phrases, and then decide how I want to visualize that information on the screen. So those are a few specific approaches that I might be trying out here in the future. In the meantime, though, if you like this more visual way of capturing ideas, of learning new things about something that you're interested in, maybe for your work, maybe for a hobby, then check out the courses available at verbaltovisual.com. That's where I teach this skill, which often goes by sketchnoting, sometimes visual note-taking. A good place to start would be my course, An Introduction to Visual Note-Taking. There I lay out all of the individual skills that you can first develop on their own and then bring together into a note-taking process that works well for you and your circumstances. I've linked to that course and a few others down below, and if you'd like to check out the conversation behind these specific ideas, I've linked to that video as well. So I hope it was helpful to see a bit of my process for digital sketchnoting. I encourage you to do your own experimenting, and I look forward to talking with you again in the next video. Until then.